Good day and welcome to another podcast with yours truly, Joel Bhagwandin, on sharing insights and analysis on topical issues within our economy. The topical discussion that will occupy the forefront of social media spaces, mainstream media, is on poverty, poverty reduction, governments, whether the government has achieved the goal of reducing poverty over the last 5 years. So you will see a lot of debates, a lot of perspectives on this topic. In yesterday, in a Facebook commentary or a Facebook presentation by none other than His Excellency the President, Dr. Mohammed Irfanari, he exclusively dealt with the framework in which government is operating, and he's alluded to a menu of policies, measures, and programs targeted towards poverty reduction. And I think he's done an excellent job in terms of explaining this framework and explaining the types of policies and programs that his administration will be pursuing, as well as those that the administration has already implemented and pursued. With that in mind, I would like to take the opportunity to examine in this period the impacts thereof in an extrapolatory manner by employing existing data to make that determination. Relatedly, before I move on, I've noted a letter in yesterday's Starbuck News by a group of, if I'm to use the Vice President's terminology or his characterization rather, a group of fossils. And I say this unapologetically, using this characterization for this group of people because of who they are, not who they are personally, but who they are academically. These are scholars I would regard them as scholars in their own right. They are PhD holders, and they dedicate their whole life to academia, and at the level no less than PhD holders with decades of experience in that space, in occupying academia. And in a letter yesterday, they wrote, this group of persons, Kenrick Hunt, Janet Bulkan, and others, were affiliated with this OGGN network, Oil and Gas Governance Network, wrote and published in the mainstream media a long-winded epistle to say that the president is wrong based on his definition for wealth, the concept of wealth. The president essentially explains that wealth has to be created, and his conversation was centered around how do you create wealth using the natural resources, using our resources, natural, physical, and our human resources. Natural, physical, human, and technological resources. How do you use those resources? How do you harness those resources in the creation of wealth? When we speak of poverty, we are talking essentially about wealth creation. For people, we're talking about prosperity, raising the prosperity level of our people in our country, raising the standard of living of our people. And so these group of PhD scholars are they're supposedly scholars. Now let me give them the credit. These PhD scholars, these academics, wrote a long-winded letter in yesterday's Tabuk News to say that the president's definition for wealth is wrong, that wealth includes our natural resources, and that wealth is calculated using an accounting method, an accounting concept, and an accounting definition for wealth, which is assets minus liability. Now, the president the president is not incorrect. These authors fail to acknowledge that one can attribute different definitions to the concept of wealth and wealth creation. They didn't acknowledge wealth creation, and that is what the president was talking about. Not just wealth, but wealth creation, and how, not the measurement, but how do you get it? First, you have to create it before you can measure it. You have to create it, generate it, build on it, accumulate it before you can measure it. They're talking about a methodology, an accounting method to measure wealth, which is asset minus liabilities, which is equal to net asset. Now, in accounting terms, yes, net asset is typically equated with net wealth, to measure wealth from an accounting perspective. But there are two other dimensions. There are many other. There could be many other. We could create many other dimensions of wealth. But relatedly, the two other dimensions of wealth that they've ignored, and the dimension that more so the president was framing his discussion, are the economic dimension and the social dimension. So accounting concept of wealth limits the perspective of wealth to that of measurement and a method of measuring wealth, which is asset minus liability. The economic perspective of wealth, however, is much more dynamic, and the economic perspective of wealth examines wealth in terms of value creation. Value creation, the production of goods and services and innovation to create value. That is a much more dynamic and broader concept of wealth than the accounting concept, which is just a measurement. Then we add the social dimension of wealth by way of definition. That speaks to the social dimension of wealth, speaks to the quality of life. So value creation, economic, and quality of life, which is the social dimension. That include things like components such as education, quality and access to education, the quality and access to essential healthcare services, the quality and access to electricity, water, potable water, those type of um, those other indicators, quality of life based on those other indicators. Um, and there are many different indices: the Human Development Index, the Global Prosperity Index, and so on, to measure wealth and to measure prosperity, and in so doing, you're measuring the level of poverty as well. So that's the first thing that I want to clarify for those of you who are following current affairs and may have read that letter. It is a very petty it's a very petty letter by scholars of people of their caliber, and they have ignored, more importantly, other dimensions of wealth using the economic and social dimensions. And really, it's more about wealth creation, not measuring wealth, but wealth creation. Now, on that note, coming back to what I want to deal with today, what I want to address today, you would recall in the previous, not the previous podcast where we dealt with anti-money laundering and the sanctioned entity and the Demerara Bank closing the accounts of some political party members. The podcast before that, the episode before that with me, I introduced this debate about the poverty rate, where there was a letter that I wrote in the mainstream media challenging the methodology employed by the IDB. There was a report published in 2024, which is a working paper on the poverty rate and assessment of the poverty rate in the Latin American Caribbean region. And in that report, it estimated that Guyana had a poverty rate of 58% and extreme poverty of 30%. I would have established that the methodology has some critical limitations. The data sources that they use in that report for Guyana was dated. They relied on a single report, which was the labor force. I explained the limitations with that report and how dated it was. It did not account for all the developments that occurred from 2020 to present. And from then to now, I started to do my own analysis. I started using available data and employing what is called extrapolatory techniques in research to estimate the level of poverty, and bearing in mind that there are different approaches in measuring poverty. There is the monetary approach, and I explained what that is, using an established baseline daily income. There is the multidimensional approach, and then there is the asset-based approach. Now, over the last 2 weeks, I've been working on developing my own model, doing my own analysis and research to determine the implied rate of poverty. But more importantly, what I want to emphasize is what is the level of prosperity if we are to develop an indigenous prosperity index. Now, there is a global prosperity index. There is such a thing called a global prosperity index. Guyana is captured in that prosperity index. There is another index developed by the United Nations called the Human Development Index. If you check the latest reports on for those indices, the Human Development Index, for example, you would see that Guyana Guyana is on an upward trend. The same for the Prosperity Index. But for the purpose of academic discussion, if we deal with those index strictly academically, like last night I was discussing this with a colleague who actually published a recent paper on on measuring poverty using these reports rather, these methodologies. And in a recent work, a recent academic paper that he has co-authored, the findings show that one has to be careful when using the multidimensional approach to measuring poverty, simply because their level of importance would vary from time to time. In a different time period, the level of importance would vary. So, for example, if we in the multidimensional approach, that is made up of indicators for different components. For example, education, the access and the level of education, health, essential health services, electricity, energy, potable water, access to clean and potable water, sanitation, technology and clean fuels for cooking purposes. The level, according to that study, the level of importance to those indicators would vary in different time periods. So if you're looking at a time series of say 30 years, in that 30-year period you may have, let's say, a 5-year period in which a particular geographic location might not probably didn't have access to potable water. Then within that 5-year period, investments were made and they now have access to potable water and sanitation. They may not have had access to electricity, and electricity was made available, was now accessible and affordable in that geographic area. 5 years later, that indicator may no longer have the importance it had 5 years ago, because in other areas, in terms of prosperity, in terms of standard of living, in terms of poverty reduction, remain unaddressed. That's just to give you an idea how to interpret the results of these studies, how to look at them in terms of contextually, and to develop your own perspective. And those are debates that will always evolve over time as more and more academic work is done. That is for the purpose of strictly an academic discussion. However, for the purpose of a practical and realistic discussion, the key question is, has there been improvements, taking into account where we came from 3 decades ago, more than 3 decades ago, because the PPP was in power since 1992, came out of power in 2015 for a 5 year period. Now they're back in power. So, given that we've come from a place of bankruptcy, given that we've come from a place of high poverty, given that we've come from a place of, in those areas, mass migration, we've suffered brain drain, significant brain drain. Now we have to reverse that. Now we have to attract our people. Given the unprecedented transformation and developments and strategic investments, albeit within a disciplined fiscal framework in the last 5 years, what is the state? What is the state of our people? What is the state of our economy? Can we say with reasonable certainty, with reasonable data to support the view that there has been dramatic improvement in the livelihoods of our people? Can we say that? And that is what I want to, that is my key message. I'm taking this amount of time, a considerable amount of time dedicated to today's podcast to explain the methodology and the nuances of what I'm about to share with you. What I'm about to share with you now, having done this study that I've been working on for the last week and a half, my estimate, having developed a prototype prosperity index. On a prosperity index, we have come from 54% on a prosperity index. We've come from 54% in the early 90s, and taking into account the developments in the last, unprecedented developments, visibly and tangibly so in the last 5 years, on a prosperity index, we are now about 87%. That is according to my prototype index that I've created, that I've developed, which I can justify and support with data. How did I arrive at 87%? That 87% implies a poverty rate of 13%. That is by combining the multidimensional approaches with the monetary approach. If we disaggregate that and take out the multidimensional and just use the monetary approach, it's about 21%. That is my estimate. Now, what are the drivers of this result? What are the drivers? Let's look at income. Let's look at the monetary indicators. What has changed dramatically from 2020 to 2024? Now, in this calculation, to assess household income, the data that are the data sources to estimate household income tax data that is publicly available. So with the income tax data, we know what is our effective income tax rate. We know what is the threshold. Therefore, we can mathematically solve an equation to find the level of aggregate income. That income, however, would exclude the persons earning below the income tax threshold. So just in those who are within the income tax bracket, aggregate household income in 2014 was $85 billion. $85 billion. By 2020, aggregate income was $221 billion. $221 billion. By 2024, aggregate household income was $739 billion. That is just those who are in the tax bracket. Now, what was there in 2024 that was not there in 2020? In 2020, we did not have the level of indirect subsidies that we have today. We did not have the level of subsidies. We did not have increases in wages and salaries that we've had in this 2020 to 2025 period. We did not have the level of expansion in the economy, not just in the oil and gas sector, but job creation in all the other sectors, including the non-oil sectors. We've had over 60, based on my estimation, and the NIS registered new employees between 2020 to present validates my estimate that you've had 70,000 new jobs created. The NIS database validates that, right? 70,000 new jobs created. In that 70,000, about 4,800 would be expats, based on my estimate. In that 70,000 as well, you've had about 20 to 25,000 jobs. Let's use the more conservative number. 20,000 of that were jobs that were restored, meaning jobs that were there before in the 2015-2020 period. Those were job losses due to job cuts administered by the economic policies, structural policies, for example, cutting jobs in the sugar belt, cutting jobs in the hinterland regions, the CSOs. So, and then you had the compounded effect of COVID, the pandemic. So you've had conservatively 20,000 jobs that were cut in that period, or 20,000 job losses in that period that were restored. So that's 20,000, and then in the 70,000, it's about 72,000, 4,800 are expats. And then the rest, the difference between 72,000, take out the 4,800, take out the 20,000, that would account for completely new jobs that were created in the economy, giving it a total of 72,000. So, and then from 2020 to present, and again the NIS annual reports could validate this, you've had about 80,000 new self-employed businesses registered. 80,000, about 80,000. Up to 2023, it was from 2020, between 2020 to 2023, 59,000. So assuming that trend of annual registration remain constant 24 and 2025, we can safely estimate between 2020 to 2025 we've had 80,000 new self-employed businesses. Again, you go to the NIS 2022 annual report, which is the most recent annual report, you would see more than 30% of self-employed persons. Look at the age and male and female breakdown. Below 40. So that means more young people are getting involved in entrepreneurship, which is wealth creation activities, because the economy is providing the opportunity. Wealth creation, job creation, income generation, young young persons getting more young people getting involved in entrepreneurship activities. That is included in that 80,000. So with that job creation, with the aggregate income that includes the indirect, now we have to account for the indirect subsidies. What constitute the indirect subsidies? What constitute the indirect subsidies? Electricity costs have been subsidized. The cost of electricity generation since the pandemic period has doubled. So about $15 billion of electricity cost is subsidized by the government. Now, if the government did not subsidize that $15 billion, which is reflected as a loss, an accumulated loss on the financial statement of GPL, that excludes the hinterland regions that are off the that are not captured in GPL. You have regional electricity generation costs that will not be captured. So if we account for all of those, it would be about $20 billion. It would be about $20 billion because the main cost, the highest cost component, the highest cost driver is fuel, and fuel has gone up from $50 in the pre-pandemic period, $50 a barrel in the pre-pandemic period, to now $70 and $80. So you have a $20 billion of subsidized electricity costs to keep electricity costs constant. You have water rates as well would be impacted similarly. That's another $4 or $5 billion of subsidized cost. The shipping rate for containers, the freight rate went up by 600%, 800% in the pandemic period. The government has, by way of policy, they've been using the pre-pandemic formula, the pre-pandemic rates, to calculate the freight cost. That's another $12 billion at today's, from the amount of containers we've been importing in 2020. That has gone up about tenfold, more than tenfold. We're doing more than tenfold business today. So that's another about $12 billion of subsidized cost. These are all indirect subsidies to household, I talk about electricity costs. The fuel imports is another area of subsidy, which in 2020 was about $15 billion at 2020 import bill for fuel. Today, based on the level of increase, that has now gone up to nearly $40 billion in fuel subsidy. When you go to the service station, and all the other goods that we consume at the consumer end, that fuel is the source of energy. Fuel cost is the source of energy that goes into the input. On the input side, in the goods that we consume, that goes through the processing and the manufacturing side, that's another $30 or $40 billion indirect subsidy. Then we have the increases in the cash grants, the direct transfers to the household, the increases in pension, and of course the national cash grant of $60 billion, which went up to about $80 billion. These are the areas I'm giving you examples of what constitute the indirect subsidy. And the indirect subsidy that wasn't there in 2020 amounts to, based on my analysis, $203 billion. $203 billion. Then you have to account for the increases in wages, increases in pension, increases in cash cash grant to the school children. There are other grants in the health sector to assist with cost in that sector. Then you have to the vulnerable groups social welfare programs, cash grants allocated for that purpose, for helping vulnerable groups, persons living with disabilities and so on, the public assistance, etc. Those cash grants are not excluded, are not included rather in the indirect subsidies of 203 billion. This this is in addition. So I've separated those uh, policy measures, those policy measures that translate to direct cash transfer to household, which would be the grants, and then there's the indirect, such as the removal of taxes for the fuel, from the fuel and the subsidy for electricity and so on. Those would be the indirect. So indirect household subsidies alone is 203 billion. So when you take that into account, it's about 739 billion. Now critics would want to come and say that, well, you got to account for remittance. So I did account for remittances. Now here's the funny thing. Here's an interesting fact about the remittances. Remittances in 2014 annually was $69 billion. Remittances, net flow of remittances. In 2020, remittances rose to $89 billion. That's in 2020. That's the pandemic year. Remittances rose to $89 billion. In 2024, remittances remain flat. Remittances remain flat. 89 billion. So there is no change. There is no change in remittances from 2020, the base year, and 2024. Okay. In fact, it went up a bit in 2021. It went up just above 80 billion in 21 and 22, because 21 and 22 we were still recovering from pandemic. So in 2021 and 2022 it went up to 90 billion. But in 23, 24 it came down back to where it was in 2020, 89 billion. So remittance flows to household is subsiding. It has remained flat, and that is an important point to note. And if we add that to the calculation, 2020 was 310 billion, remittance included. 2024, 828 billion, remittance included. Now, altogether, we've had a 234% increase in household income. That has translated to, if we estimate we have about 226,000 households, the annual household income is over $3 million. Annual household income is over $3 million, up from $1.2 million in 2020. Up from $1.2 million in 2020. So this is a massive, this cannot be understated. This cannot be understated. And if we divide that, remember this is just the tax bracket. This data does not account for those who are not captured in the tax bracket. And so by just using our tax bracket data and using the labor force survey of 2021 to use that as a base year, and accounting for the new job creations, I mentioned the 70,000 to 80,000 new self-employed persons, and that those data are validated when you cross-reference it with the registration for at NIS for insurance, NIS. That alone, using the monetary measure, would give you the result above the poverty line. When you look at income, average income per household, that is above the minimum, the baseline poverty rate using the monetary measure. That's how I arrive at 21%. And these data, I've given you the data, I've given you the data source, and that's the result. Now, on quickly, I see I've exceeded my 30 minutes already. If we use the multidimensional approach now, in 2023, in 2023, there was a voluntary assessment on conducted by the United Nations. The report is publicly available. Conducted by the United Nations to assess Guyana's progress towards the, the sustainable development goals. Right? That is the source. That is the source of the data that that are used in the multidimensional assessment. And these are the results for 2024. Households with improved access to electricity as of 2024, 92%. Households using clean fuels and technology for cooking. This is United Nations assessment now. I'm just using their data from their assessment to create this prototype index. Households with improved access to electricity, 92%. And this is at a national level. This includes hinterland regions. Households using clean fuels and technology for cooking, 92%. Households with improved access to sanitation facility, 86%. Households with access to potable water, 97%. Population with access to essential healthcare services, 71%. Now on the education side, the literacy rate is 93%. That is literacy rate, 93%. Now the labor force survey in 2021 has the level of education of the labor market. And as of 2021, point of interest to note is that the level of tertiary education, persons who possess a master's and a bachelor's, master's and doctoral degree was less than 1%. Now, if we are to add the 39,000 scholarships with about another 7,500 persons graduating annually from the University of Guyana, between University of Guyana, Nations, and Texel and so on, another 7,500, that percentage of tertiary education has gone up in the last 5 years from less than 5%. If I include bachelor's degree in that equation, bachelor's, master's and PhD in 2021 was less than 5%. If we add the 39,000 scholarships, school scholarships, and the amount of graduates from 2020 to 2025, that 5% has gone up to nearly 20%. Nearly 20% with a tertiary level education. So with that, there has been, these indicators have point to one key message, that in the last 5 years we've had considerable improvements, dramatic improvements, and if the IDB and the World Bank were to actually update their models, they would find that Guyana is actually an outlier in those indices. Guyana is an outlier on the prosperity index. The prosperity index moving in this direction sharply, and the poverty, the implied poverty moving in this direction sharply. That's an outlier, because no other country in the world has experienced what Guyana has experienced in the last 5 years. So, on a, on a prototype prosperity index that I've created using this data, I've explained where I got the data source from. I've explained at a high level how I developed this index, how I did the analysis, what are the variables I took into account, what are the factors. I point you to how those factors could be independently verified, and their reasonable assumptions driving them. And this is where we are 5 years later. 80%, north of 80%, upwards of 80% on a prototype prosperity index. I'll end here for today, and I'll continue this discussion by we'll revert to uh, assessing the PPP's 2020 manifesto against the last 5 years, assessing the impacts and the various items in there, the various deliverables in there that were achieved. So thank you for listening. Catch you on the next episode.